I've been asked on occasion whether legislative intent language might somehow trump statutory language. Sometimes there are instances where a bill in the legislature contains both statutory changes, amending, adding, or repealing code sections, as well as legislative intent statements, often in the form of findings and declarations. Now, we would expect these two types of provisions to be consistent with each other. And with a well drafted bill, it may not even be necessary for a court to resort to these legislative findings and declarations to determine legislative intent because hopefully the language of the statute is clear. Even in such an instance, it might be additional assurance sometimes to the legislative branch that the judicial branch will interpret the statute in the manner that the legislature has intended. This conclusion would seem obvious to both bill drafters and observers alike. However, what happens if the statutory language doesn't necessarily comport with the legislative intent statements or the legislative findings and declarations, or vice versa? How should a court treat that sort of an occurrence? Now, by way of background, there's a presumption that a statutory amendment was intended to change the meaning of the statute only when there's a material change that's contained in the language of that amended act. And this dates back to a 1944 California appellate court decision in Dalton versus Baldwin. And in other words, a statute can only be changed by a material amendment to the statutory language itself, not merely by legislative intent language. At least we would hope that's not the case. However, there are a handful of documented instances where the legislature has enacted legislative findings and declarations that are inconsistent with or perhaps not compatible with what the actual bill language says and what it changed or did not change in the codes. For example, if the proposed statutory changes were taken out of the bill, but the legislative findings and declarations remained in the bill and subsequently were enacted as uncodified language, what should a court do with that? It would make sense for a court to not rely upon the intent language, but rather to determine whether the underlying statute was actually changed and to first give effect to those changes. In other words, if the legislature intends to change a statute, then the legislature has to do so by enacting a bill that adds, amends, or repeals a code. Now, in most instances, the courts have ruled, for example, that the amendment of a statute is evidence of an intention to change the rule stated by the court in applying its provisions. The court said this in Butcher versus Brower in 1942, California Supreme Court. And the fact that a lawmaking body knew that decisions of appellate courts and made a substantial change in phraseology of a subdivision of the statute indicated the legislature's intention to effect a change in the statutory meaning. This was stated by the Court of Appeal in 1940 in Thomas versus Driscoll. Now, there's no need for intent language to be considered by the courts unless there's some ambiguity in the statutory language, because the purpose of legislative intent language is to provide clarity, particularly if any ambiguity arises. However, as the California Supreme Court said in 1999 in Diamond Multimedia Systems versus the Superior Court, if there is no ambiguity in the language, then we presume the legislature meant what it said and the plain meaning of the statute governs. We've also seen that at the federal court level, the US Supreme Court said in Conroy versus Oniskoff in 1993, we are governed by laws, not by the intention of legislators. So as a result, the logical conclusion would be that legislative intent language or findings and declarations cannot in any way overrule statutory language, particularly in a case where no changes were made to the statute. Nonetheless, it hasn't always been the case, and there are some advocates who believe legislative intent language should also guide the courts of this state, even if there weren't any statutory changes made.